On an ordinary Sunday morning, a teenage soprano vanished from her church choir without a sound, her backpack, sheet music, and half-scribbled notes left behind like a frozen moment in time. No struggle, no witness, no trace. For 2 years, silence gripped the community, each rehearsal echoing her absence. But when the choir gathered again, something unexplainable happened. Her solo returned, sung as if guided by an unseen presence, turning grief into a chilling mystery with an unexpected twist. Sunday morning at St. Mark's Church began like any other, with sunlight spilling through the stained glass windows and the faint scent of waxed pews filling the air. Outside, the streets were quiet, the kind of calm that always precedes a day of worship and community gathering. Inside, 16-year-old Emily Harper hurried down the aisle toward the choir loft, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, sheet music clutched tightly in her hand. She moved with a sense of purpose. A bright smile across her face, chatting with a few friends along the way about the upcoming recital. It was a recital she had been anticipating for weeks, and her excitement was infectious. Choir director Margaret Lane, a woman in her early 50s with decades of experience, noted Emily's energy as she entered, thinking how rare it was to see a teenager so fully invested in church music. Margaret had always relied on Emily's steady soprano for the most challenging pieces, and she had no doubt that Emily would be a highlight of the performance. The choir began their warm-up exercises, voices blending in unison, some cracking on high notes, others humming with practiced precision. Emily joined in, moving seamlessly through scales, her voice distinct, clear, and confident. She hummed along while arranging her sheet music, occasionally exchanging glances with Margaret, who nodded in approval. The atmosphere was calm but alive, the kind of quiet concentration that fills a space with expectation. Then, somewhere between the third and fourth scales, Emily's voice abruptly stopped. Her notes didn't trail off, they simply vanished. At first, Margaret assumed she had stepped out for a moment, perhaps a restroom break or a forgotten item, she thought. But when she looked toward Emily's usual place, her eyes fell on an empty spot where the teenager had been standing. The chair was pushed back slightly, her bag left on the floor as if she'd planned to return, and her sheet music still open on the stand. A small pencil lay beside it, untouched. Margaret's initial assumption of a minor absence quickly shifted into unease. She called Emily's name softly, then louder, moving from one side of the choir loft to the other. The room remained still, save for the faint rustle of pages and the low hum of the other choir members. At first, no one seemed to notice the disappearance. Emily's friends glanced around with puzzled expressions, thinking perhaps she had ducked into the hallway or the bathroom. But when no response came, whispers began to circulate. A few of the younger choir members exchanged anxious looks, a cold sense of wrongness creeping over them. Margaret felt a sudden tightness in her chest. She moved quickly down the steps, scanning the aisles, calling for Emily, her voice now trembling with worry. No one had seen her leave. The first ripple of panic spread through the congregation as word traveled quickly from the choir loft. Parents who had been waiting in the back of the church were approached by teachers and volunteers, their own confusion turning into fear. Phone calls were made to homes and relatives, each unanswered ring adding weight to the mounting anxiety. Volunteers began searching the building, opening doors, checking closets, and moving chairs, but Emily was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of a struggle, no loud noises, no disturbances, nothing to indicate that she had been forced out. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The open sheet music, the abandoned pencil, and the backpack that still contained her hymn books painted a chilling picture of sudden absence. The church secretary called the local police around 10:15 a.m., reporting Emily as missing. By the time officers arrived, the small congregation was in a state of shock. Parents clutched one another, some rocking in disbelief, while volunteers gave fragmented accounts of the morning. Margaret, usually composed and calm, recounted how Emily had been cheerful, enthusiastic, and completely engaged just moments before. Officers began a methodical search of the church, moving room to room, attic to basement, while taking statements from witnesses. Every corner was examined, every exit logged, and every possible hiding place considered. Nothing was found. It was as though Emily had disappeared into thin air. Outside, the first responders canvassed the surrounding streets. They spoke to neighbors who were watering lawns, walking dogs, or sipping coffee on their porches. Some reported hearing nothing unusual. Others claimed they had seen a young girl near the church earlier, but none could confirm her movements after the morning had begun. Local news outlets were alerted, and soon, flyers were being printed and distributed throughout the neighborhood. Social media posts began circulating, and hashtags calling for Emily's return appeared on multiple platforms. The emotional weight of the morning settled heavily on everyone involved. Fear, confusion, and disbelief mingled with the faint hope that perhaps she had wandered off on her own, only to be found moments later. That hope, however, diminished as the minutes stretched into hours and the hours into a tense, silent afternoon. By late morning, law enforcement expanded the search radius, involving volunteers to comb the streets, nearby parks, and even the church cemetery. Canines were brought in, sniffing for traces of Emily's scent, but the dogs, too, were unable to follow any trail. The small town felt a sense of collective grief and alarm, neighbors consoling one another while silently fearing the worst. The quiet Sunday morning that had promised music and community had transformed into a day of panic, uncertainty, and unanswerable questions. Emily Harper, once so full of life and song, was gone, leaving behind only the faint echoes of her soprano, her abandoned sheet music, and the terrifying mystery of how a teenager could vanish from a familiar populated place without a trace. The church, once a haven of comfort and routine, now felt haunted by absence, a space where every echo, every shuffle, and every note played on the piano reminded those inside that something was terribly wrong. Margaret returned to the choir loft, her hands gripping the railing, staring at the empty spot where Emily had stood, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. The day that began with music and anticipation had become the first chapter in a mystery that would grip the community for years to come, the tension of unanswered questions hanging over every whispered name, every search, and every prayer. As news of Emily Harper's disappearance spread through St. Mark's Church, a tense, almost tangible panic gripped the congregation and the wider neighborhood. Parents rushed into the church, scanning faces for any sign of reassurance, while their children clung to their hands, eyes wide and questioning. The initial disbelief that a teenager could vanish from a familiar populated place without a trace quickly morphed into alarm. Volunteers, neighbors, and family members began to organize informal searches, dividing the surrounding streets into grids, calling out her name, and peering into alleyways, yards, and parked cars. The town's rhythm, usually predictable and calm on a Sunday morning, was shattered by urgency and fear. Local authorities arrived shortly after the calls were made, officers moving with the methodical precision of those accustomed to missing persons cases, though the sense of urgency was amplified by the raw emotion of the community. Each officer took detailed statements from witnesses, logging where Emily had been last seen and what she had been wearing. Neighbors were interviewed one by one. Some recalled seeing her walk past their windows, her backpack bouncing lightly, seemingly heading toward the church, but none could confirm seeing her leave the building afterward. Others admitted that they hadn't noticed anything unusual, yet the absence of certainty only heightened the tension. Every discrepancy, no matter how minor, was noted for follow-up. Officers began tracing possible routes Emily could have taken, mapping the neighborhood, the nearby parks, and even less frequented side streets. Meanwhile, inside the church, forensic teams began their meticulous work, cataloging Emily's personal belongings left behind. Her backpack was opened carefully, its contents laid out on a clean table and photographed. Her sheet music, perfectly arranged for the morning rehearsal, remained undisturbed. A pencil lay at a precise angle on the stand, as if dropped mid-use. Investigators noted the absence of any signs of struggle, no broken doors or forced entry, and nothing that would indicate a sudden, violent abduction. The room itself seemed untouched, almost frozen in the moment of her vanishing. Forensic analysts examined fingerprints and surfaces, confirming that nothing had been moved aside from her presence. These observations only deepened the mystery. Emily had disappeared, yet everything suggested she had simply stepped away, voluntarily or involuntarily, without leaving a trace. Social media began to amplify the case almost immediately. Posts on local community pages, parents' profiles, and neighborhood groups circulated Emily's photo along with basic information about her disappearance. Friends and family urged people to share, creating a digital web of concern that spread faster than the physical searches. Volunteers printed flyers, stapling them to telephone poles, handing them out to passing pedestrians, and leaving them in stores and cafes throughout the town. The collective effort reflected the town's desperation, but each hour that passed without a concrete lead only intensified the anxiety. The emotional weight pressed heavily on everyone involved. Parents hugged one another, holding themselves together even as tears rolled down their cheeks. Siblings whispered prayers, unsure whether to hope or fear. The silence of unanswered calls and absent footsteps reverberated like a heavy shadow across the small community. Amid the chaos, investigators revisited Emily's personal space at home, seeking any clues that might shed light on her sudden disappearance. Her diary, previously overlooked as a teenage musing, became an object of careful scrutiny. Among ordinary entries describing school, music practice, and weekend plans, there were subtle notes that caught the attention of authorities. Emily had written about feeling watched, of fleeting shadows that made her uncomfortable, though she never elaborated on who or what had caused these feelings. Some entries hinted at anxiety around interactions with people she had recently met through choir and school, though there was no direct accusation or obvious threat. These fragmented thoughts painted a picture of a girl aware of something troubling, yet unwilling or unsure how to confront it. Investigators cataloged each observation, knowing that even minor details could later connect dots that currently seemed unrelated. As the morning gave way to afternoon, search parties expanded. Teams of volunteers and officers canvassed not only streets but also wooded areas near the outskirts of town, playgrounds, and even abandoned buildings. Canines trained in search and rescue were brought in, sniffing every possible trail in the hopes of detecting Emily's scent. Despite their efforts, no reliable trail emerged, and the sense of frustration and helplessness mounted. The search grids, mapped meticulously by authorities, were crossed repeatedly, each sweep yielding nothing more than empty sidewalks and still, quiet yards. Meanwhile, inside the church, choir members sat in silence, grappling with the absence of their friend and teammate. Every familiar creak of the floorboards or rustle of sheet music seemed unnaturally loud, an auditory reminder of the missing presence that had once filled the space with life. By late afternoon, the reality began to settle in. Emily Harper had vanished. Parents, volunteers, and investigators faced the unnerving truth that her disappearance was not just a brief absence, but a full, unexplained disappearance that could not be explained by simple oversight or teenage wandering. Each passing hour amplified fear and speculation, while the town held its collective breath. Families consoled one another, yet an unspoken dread lingered, the kind that comes from knowing someone you love could be in danger, and yet, for reasons you cannot fathom, remains completely out of reach. The day closed with no answers. Only questions and an eerie silence that filled the church pews and the streets alike. Emily's room remained intact, her belongings untouched, her diary open to entries that whispered unease but offered no clarity. The search would continue, and the community, though exhausted and frightened, would not relent. But as night fell over the quiet town, one truth became clear. A teenager had disappeared from a place of safety, leaving behind personal items and cryptic hints of unease, and no one knew where she had gone. Every hand that had combed the streets, every officer that had reviewed witness statements, and every neighbor that scanned the shadows was left to confront the impossible question: how does a girl vanish without a trace, and what secrets had gone unnoticed in the life she left behind? In the weeks following Emily Harper's disappearance, St. Mark's Church Choir tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the absence of one voice left a void that seemed impossible to fill. Rehearsals resumed, led by Mrs. Donnelly, the choir director, whose stern professionalism now carried an undercurrent of exhaustion and grief. Solo parts that had been Emily's responsibility were reassigned, but the teenagers struggled to match her effortless precision and emotive phrasing. Each rehearsal became a painful reminder of what was missing. Notes that had once soared with confidence now stumbled in hesitant echoes, and the harmony felt uneven, as if the music itself mourned. The teenagers' faces, usually animated with youthful energy and laughter, were now drawn and quiet, eyes lingering on empty pews in the familiar spaces Emily had once occupied. Interviews with choir members revealed the depth of the trauma. Sarah Klein, a soprano who had shared many duets with Emily, describes a pervasive sense of disbelief and fear. "Some days it felt like she was still here," Sarah recalls, her voice trembling. "I'd hear a note, a breath, or a laugh, and I'd turn, expecting to see her, but no one was there." Other members echo similar experiences, describing faint sounds during empty rehearsals, soft whispers, a high note that seemed to float from nowhere, or the rustle of sheet music in otherwise silent rooms. Whether imagination or something unexplained, these occurrences left the group unsettled and hyper-aware. Each rehearsal tinged with tension and apprehension. The emotional strain began to take its toll, manifesting in exhaustion, irritability, and a pervasive sense of anxiety that extended beyond the church walls. Mrs. Donnelly faced the impossible task of keeping the choir functional while navigating the emotional fragility of her students. She recounts nights spent lying awake, wondering if she had overlooked a warning sign, questioning every interaction she had with Emily, every moment that might have hinted at danger. Her leadership was now a delicate balance between discipline and compassion as she encouraged the choir to maintain their schedules while acknowledging the weight of loss. She implemented moments of reflection during rehearsals, asking members to share memories of Emily or to dedicate a phrase in the music to her presence. These gestures provided some comfort, but could not erase the undercurrent of grief that persisted. Local discussions began to emerge outside the church, fueled by the community's collective unease. Rumors circulated, each more unsettling than the last. Some whispered about the possibility of cult involvement, drawing on the church setting as a point of fear. Others speculated about online predators, citing Emily's diary entries and her burgeoning interest in social media as potential vulnerabilities. A smaller, quieter group entertained the idea of something supernatural, suggesting that Emily's spirit lingered in the choir room, responding through fleeting sounds and whispered notes. While authorities dismissed these claims as anecdotal, the psychological impact on the choir and community was undeniable. Fear and uncertainty infiltrated conversations, creating an atmosphere in which imagination and reality blurred. The teenagers themselves found solace and tension intertwined within the music. Practices were at once therapeutic and agonizing, a place where memories of Emily coexisted with the demands of performance. Members reported moments when a solo note, played by someone else, seemed to resonate with Emily's timbre, stirring both comfort and sorrow. It became an unspoken rule that any hesitation or sudden shift in tone might be interpreted as her presence, a haunting echo of familiarity that both soothed and unsettled. These experiences, though subjective, were profoundly real to the choir, shaping their emotional landscape and influencing their ability to function normally. Outside observers noticed the change as well. Parents, teachers, and friends described teenagers who seemed older than their years, carrying the weight of unresolved trauma. Sleep schedules were disrupted, laughter came less easily, and moments of joy were often punctuated by sudden tears or distant gazes. The loss of Emily extended beyond her absence in the choir. It was a psychological rupture that affected every facet of their lives. Social activities once shared with her became reminders of absence, and the church itself, previously a space of community and safety, now carried an echo of vulnerability and fear. Despite the heaviness, there were attempts to reclaim normalcy. Choir members supported one another, sharing responsibilities and encouraging expression through music. Each rehearsal became a small act of defiance against despair, a refusal to allow grief to silence their collective voice completely. Mrs. Donnelly, while privately struggling, emphasized routine and consistency, believing that structure could anchor the choir amidst emotional turbulence. This approach, though imperfect, provided a framework within which members could navigate their pain and maintain connection, even as Emily remained missing. The tension between grief and hope became a defining feature of the choir's daily existence. Each empty note, each fleeting whisper, and each assignment of Emily's former parts was a reminder of loss and an opportunity to persevere. Choir members began documenting unusual occurrences, careful to distinguish between memory, imagination, and potential reality, creating a patchwork record that would later intrigue investigators and community members alike. Their accounts, filled with detail, emotional intensity, and haunting specificity, contributed to the slow, simmering mystery that surrounded Emily's disappearance. As the weeks turned into months, the community remained attentive and uneasy. The choir's struggle was both symbolic and literal, a microcosm of the broader uncertainty that enveloped the town. Each rehearsal ended with silence that lingered, the empty spaces where Emily had once stood serving as a constant, unspoken question. Would she return, or was her absence permanent? The emotional weight pressed relentlessly on the choir, shaping their experiences and altering the rhythm of their lives. And though whispers, rumors, and unexplained sounds persisted, one truth became undeniable. The community and the choir were irrevocably changed, carrying with them the haunting imprint of a teenager who had vanished in a place meant for sanctuary and song. By the time investigators completed the initial canvassing of St. Mark's Church and its surroundings, the trail had already begun to grow cold. CCTV cameras outside the building provided grainy footage of a quiet Sunday morning, but the quality was too poor to identify any faces or vehicles clearly. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, and timestamps offered no clues as to the movements of anyone who might have approached the church that day. Neighbors who had been asked to recount unusual observations reported nothing. No strange cars, no individuals loitering near the church, no sounds of struggle. The lack of concrete leads frustrated law enforcement, and each passing day without progress deepened the emotional strain on Emily's family. Police broadened the investigation, speaking with anyone who had interacted with Emily in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Friends, classmates, teachers, and even distant relatives were questioned, but nothing emerged beyond vague recollections of her cheerful demeanor and occasional hints of teenage anxieties, typical for a 16-year-old. The diary she kept was meticulously examined, with entries about schoolwork, friendships, and choir rehearsals cataloged for potential clues. A few passages hinted at feeling watched or uneasy, but no names, locations, or concrete threats were ever mentioned. For the investigators, these subtle hints were frustratingly vague, providing emotional texture but no actionable evidence. As the investigation stalled, media attention intensified. Local news outlets ran repeated segments detailing Emily's disappearance, often replaying images of her smiling face from choir performances or family photos. Social media amplified the story, with community pages and regional forums dissecting every reported detail. Speculation ran rampant, with some commenters accusing unknown predators, while others feared a tragedy had befallen the girl far from home. National outlets picked up the story as a cautionary tale, labeling it as emblematic of the dangers lurking in suburban communities where parents and neighbors assumed children were safe within familiar spaces. The constant media coverage created a dual pressure. The family felt scrutinized, and investigators faced public demands for answers they could not yet provide. Amid the public attention, Emily's younger siblings began showing signs of emotional strain. Psychologists were brought in to help the family cope with the trauma, emphasizing the invisible toll on children who live with uncertainty. Her 12-year-old brother, Michael, displayed heightened anxiety, frequently asking when Emily would return and refusing to be left alone in rooms where she had spent time. Her younger sister, Lily, showed signs of withdrawal, avoiding school activities and crying without explanation. Specialists provided coping strategies, suggesting structured routines, journaling, and controlled exposure to media reports. These interventions offered some relief, but the underlying anxiety could not be erased, and every mention of Emily's name sparked renewed distress. The first anniversary of Emily's disappearance passed quietly, a date marked by private remembrance rather than public ceremonies. Her family visited her favorite spots in the town, leaving flowers and notes, hoping that symbolic gestures could preserve her memory in the absence of closure. Choir members performed a tribute at a service, but even this collective act of remembrance underscored the pain of her absence. The lack of progress in the case, no new leads, no suspects, no sightings, created a pervasive sense of helplessness. For law enforcement, the frustration was professional and procedural. For the family, it was deeply personal and existential. Days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, with the emotional toll compounding as hope and fear became intertwined. Detective Lieutenant Alan Hughes, assigned to the case, recalled the growing public pressure as almost palpable. Calls from media outlets became routine, and every detail, every rumor, and every unverified sighting needed to be addressed with care. Hughes describes a delicate balance between transparency and caution, explaining that releasing unconfirmed information could incite false leads or public hysteria, while silence invited criticism. Each press briefing felt like walking a tightrope, and the weight of community expectation added to the already intense stress of managing a missing person investigation. Despite the mounting pressure, investigators found themselves navigating dead ends at nearly every turn. Neighborhood canvassing repeatedly yielded no new witnesses. Online searches for potential predators returned only false leads. Cell phone data and call records from Emily's devices provided no discernible patterns or contacts beyond friends and family. Law enforcement cataloged each possibility meticulously, but every avenue eventually concluded without result. This professional impasse mirrored the family's experience at home, a profound sense of stasis, with days blending into one another, punctuated only by phone calls, media coverage, and personal reminders of a teenager who should have been thriving in the world around her. Community members tried to maintain normalcy, but an undercurrent of unease permeated everyday life. Parents hesitated to allow their children to travel alone. School events included additional supervision, and casual neighborhood conversations often returned to Emily's case. The absence of answers became almost a character in its own right, a quiet, unrelenting presence that informed decisions, conversations, and behaviors. In many ways, the lack of progress was more oppressive than any visible danger because it made the disappearance infinite, a mystery without beginning or end. By the conclusion of the first year, the investigative team had meticulously documented every clue, sighting, and speculation, yet the central question, where was Emily Harper, remained unanswered. For her family, every day was a negotiation between grief and hope, between despair and the faint possibility of discovery. The public, too, had been drawn into a state of collective vigil, watching and waiting, offering theories, prayers, and commentary, yet receiving no resolution. The dead ends were not just procedural, they were emotional, psychological, and communal, forming a pressure that would shape every next step of the investigation and, eventually, every revelation to come. 2 years had passed since Emily Harper's disappearance, and the case had largely faded from the front pages, though not from the memories of those closest to her. Her family maintained a vigil in the quiet spaces of their home, still haunted by unanswered questions, while investigators periodically revisited old evidence in hopes of a breakthrough. It was during one such review that a former choir member, Sarah Bennett, recalled an overlooked detail from months before Emily vanished. The memory surfaced suddenly, unbidden. After a rehearsal, Emily had received a slip of paper with a phone number from a visitor who lingered at the back of the church. At the time, Sarah remembered, it seemed innocuous, almost ordinary, a music tutor perhaps, or someone offering extra lessons. The detail had been dismissed by adults as typical teenage curiosity, yet in hindsight, it now carried the weight of potential significance. Detectives immediately sought to trace the number. Phone records indicated it belonged to a local music tutor named Thomas Kendrick, a man in his early 40s who taught piano and voice to a handful of students in the neighborhood. When questioned, Kendrick was cooperative but emphatic. He insisted he had no connection to Emily, no knowledge of her disappearance, and no interactions beyond those with his regular clients. Investigators documented his statements and corroborated his alibi for the day of the disappearance. Yet the mere existence of the number reintroduced the possibility of an overlooked connection. For law enforcement, the investigation had shifted subtly but significantly, from a random disappearance to the potential of a focused, intentional scenario. Meanwhile, Emily's personal devices, which had been preserved in her bedroom for forensic analysis, were revisited. Hard drives, tablets, and phones were examined with updated forensic software capable of recovering deleted messages and hidden logs. Analysts uncovered a set of erased texts and notes that suggested Emily had been secretly arranging music lessons she never mentioned to her family. Dates, times, and locations were partially visible, and some entries referenced a desire to improve for the recital or practice in private. While nothing overtly criminal was identified in these messages, the secrecy hinted at a cautious avoidance of adult supervision. Investigators noted a pattern. Emily had been increasingly protective of her private interactions, a behavior consistent with a teenager growing aware of external attention she didn't welcome. Further analysis of her digital footprint revealed something more unsettling. Metadata from her emails and cloud storage indicated that some of the files, including rehearsal recordings, had been accessed from devices outside her home network. Though no definitive IP addresses could be traced to a specific individual, the pattern suggested an observer, someone who might have monitored her routines or interests without her knowledge. Investigators began considering a stalker or obsessive admirer, someone attuned to her movements, her rehearsals, and her musical pursuits. The notion was chilling in its intimacy. The person may have been watching her for weeks, months, or perhaps even longer. Detectives conducted follow-up interviews with choir members and close friends, looking for any indication of unusual interactions. A few recalled Emily mentioning receiving unexpected compliments on her singing from someone who occasionally attended practices, always remaining on the periphery. Some of these references were vague, casual, and easily dismissible at the time, but when pieced together, they painted a subtle portrait of attention that, in retrospect, was intrusive. The investigation now had to navigate the fine line between innocent mentorship and potential predatory behavior. Every recollection was scrutinized, every minor detail cross-referenced against digital evidence, and each fragment became a potential key to understanding the disappearance. The forensic team expanded their efforts to analyze all deleted communications on Emily's devices, recovering partial conversations that had been carefully erased. Certain messages referenced secret sessions and practice after church, but the sender's identity remained obscured. Some messages contained timestamps that aligned with days Emily had been seen behaving unusually distracted or anxious, according to family accounts and diary entries. Investigators began mapping these timelines meticulously, searching for patterns, but the sender's anonymity complicated every deduction. It was as if Emily had attempted to interact with someone she trusted, yet the digital footprint left behind suggested caution, unease, and a growing awareness of possible danger. The police also revisited Thomas Kendrick, the music tutor, with the newly recovered messages in hand. Kendrick reviewed the texts, insisting again that he had no knowledge of Emily's interactions with anyone else and that he had no students fitting her description beyond the regular roster. Investigators noted inconsistencies between the times Emily was allegedly in contact with the number and Kendrick's logged sessions, further confirming that someone else may have been using his contact information to communicate with her. The theory of a stalker or obsessive individual gained traction, with law enforcement considering the possibility that the mysterious number had been a conduit rather than a genuine personal connection. For Emily's family, the emergence of this lead was both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it suggested a tangible avenue for investigation, something more concrete than the cold dead ends that had defined the prior 2 years. Terrifying because it implied that Emily had been interacting with someone unknown to them, someone who had potentially observed her life with intent. The thought that their daughter may have been under the scrutiny of a hidden figure intensified the already profound grief and fear. Her parents clung to the hope that this lead could reveal the truth, yet the uncertainty threatened to consume their days and nights. By the end of the investigation pivot, the case had acquired a new focus: the possibility of obsession, a secret observer, and deliberate targeting. Law enforcement began to reconstruct Emily's final months with unprecedented attention, retracing her steps to rehearsals, music sessions, and social interactions. Every detail mattered. Every minor inconsistency could hold significance, and every recovered message was a potential clue. For the first time in years, the disappearance was no longer just a tragedy defined by absence. It had become an active, dynamic investigation into a hidden threat, one that might finally explain why Emily Harper vanished so abruptly and why, for 2 long years, no one could say where she had gone. 2 years after Emily Harper's disappearance, the church announced a memorial recital in her honor, a gathering meant to celebrate her life and her music, yet it carried the weight of absence in every note. Flyers were posted in the community, and invitations were extended to neighbors, families, and former choir members. For those who had watched Emily vanish without explanation, the recital was intended as a moment of closure. But for the choir, it became a crucible of grief. Rehearsals began under the strain of collective sorrow, and each session was colored by a palpable tension. Every note sung, every harmony practiced, seemed to echo the memory of the girl who had disappeared so abruptly, leaving behind only the fragments of her life. The choir director, Margaret Hall, struggled to maintain focus. She assigned Emily's solo pieces to other singers, yet there was a recurring sense that the music retained her presence. Teenagers whispered to one another after rehearsals, claiming they occasionally heard a voice, delicate and unmistakable, carrying Emily's tonal quality, drifting through the empty aisles of the church long after practice ended. At first, Margaret dismissed these accounts as grief-driven imagination, a natural projection of the heart trying to fill the void left by a lost friend. But as the phenomenon persisted, curiosity and unease mingled in equal measure. One night, after a late rehearsal, the church's digital piano was left powered on. When staff returned the next morning, a note sequence was playing in repetition, a melody that mirrored Emily's solo lines almost precisely. Technicians confirmed that no automatic playback had been set, and there was no electrical explanation for the sequence. Choir members, summoned to witness the anomaly, experienced a mixture of astonishment and fear. Some were convinced it was coincidence, a random alignment of notes, yet others felt an eerie presence in the way the keys struck themselves with perfect timing. Margaret, determined to understand what was happening, sought the expertise of musicologists and sound engineers, hoping for a rational explanation. The experts examined the digital piano's internal logs, confirming that the sequence had not been entered manually and that no previous programming could account for the patterns. They noted, however, that human interpretation could sometimes perceive patterns in repetition, though the precision of Emily's sheet music lines left them unsettled. Margaret shared the findings with the choir, careful not to frame them as supernatural, yet the effect on the students was undeniable. Rehearsals became charged with both anticipation and dread. Every practice session carried the invisible weight of Emily's presence, her notes almost as if lingering in the air, guiding the singers. Parents of choir members observed changes in their children. Some reported their teenagers speaking in tones of wonder or fear, describing hearing Emily in moments of quiet, in empty classrooms, or while practicing alone at home. One student, Hannah, recounted being startled by a faint voice that seemed to mimic Emily's articulation, encouraging her to sustain a note longer, to adjust dynamics, and even to express phrasing Emily had favored. Psychologists consulted by the church suggested these experiences could be grief manifesting in auditory hallucinations, a projection of longing and emotional intensity. Yet they also warned that the effect was having a tangible impact on the students' performance and mental state. As the memorial recital approached, rehearsals took on a rhythm that blended fear, hope, and reverence. Choir members began reporting subtle synchronizations, the digital piano playing certain motifs just before they sang them. Sheet music occasionally found to turn to Emily's sections when left unattended, and instruments that seemed to resonate in her favored keys without any visible touch. The director meticulously documented these occurrences, consulting the musicologists on patterns, scales, and coincidences, attempting to discern a logical sequence that might explain the phenomena. Each consultation produced more questions than answers, deepening the sense of unease. Despite the anomalies, the choir pressed on. Margaret emphasized that the recital was not only a tribute, but also a statement of resilience, an effort to channel grief into art. Students practiced with increasing intensity, each aware that they were not merely performing music, but participating in an unfolding mystery that seemed to straddle the line between memory and something unexplainable. The experience fostered a bond among the singers, one forged through shared vulnerability and heightened awareness of Emily's absence. They became attuned to every subtle shift in sound, every stray note, listening for the intangible presence that had become a constant companion during rehearsals. Community members were informed that the recital would be dedicated to Emily, and the anticipation of the event brought a cautious optimism. Flyers described her life, her love of music, and the significance of the memorial, and local press outlets framed the story as a human interest piece, highlighting the emotional impact on the choir. Yet, even as the event approached, the choir could not shake the sensation that Emily's influence lingered within the walls of the church. Some performers described moments of goosebumps, a chill in the air, or the sense that a guiding hand was present, subtle but unmistakable, shaping the music from beyond reach. The night before the recital, the choir gathered for a final run-through. Each note, each phrase was delivered with reverence, yet there was a tension in the silence that followed every phrase. Margaret looked over her students, sensing their fear, their awe, and their grief, and reminded them that the purpose was remembrance, not explanation. Still, as the final chords faded, the digital piano struck a brief, precise sequence from Emily's favorite solo, a haunting echo that left the room in stunned quiet. Choir members exchanged glances, some trembling, others with tears, realizing that the presence of the girl they had lost was felt as strongly as ever, guiding the music toward the memorial that would honor her in the most profound, unforgettable way. It was a quiet evening at St. Mark's Church when the choir gathered for another rehearsal in preparation for the upcoming memorial recital. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with both anticipation and the lingering absence of Emily Harper, whose disappearance had become an unshakable wound in the community. Students filed in, their eyes darting nervously to the empty space where Emily once stood, her presence now replaced by memory and silence. Margaret Hall, the choir director, began with warm-ups and simple harmonies, aiming to focus the singers and to remind them that the music itself was their anchor in the storm of grief. Yet that evening, the music would take an unexpected, inexplicable turn. As the choir progressed through the rehearsal, a soft, unmistakable melody began to rise above the collective sound. At first, Margaret thought one of the newer students had accidentally started a solo line, but as the notes continued, it became clear to everyone that this was Emily's solo, precise, intentional, and hauntingly familiar. The melody matched the final piece Emily had been preparing before her disappearance, a composition she had practiced tirelessly in the months leading up to that fateful day. Choir members froze, their eyes widening in disbelief as the harmony unfolded without prompting, unaccompanied by any technological device. Instruments remained silent, and no one had rehearsed the piece in its entirety. Yet the solo emerged fully formed, as though guided by an invisible hand. A mixture of shock, awe, and unease settled over the room. Students exchanged whispers, some trembling, others clutching their sheet music as if to anchor themselves to reality. Margaret tried to calm the group, insisting there must be a logical explanation, but her own voice wavered. Each note carried a subtle weight, a sense of intention that seemed to reach beyond the physical space, threading through the choir as though Emily herself were present, conducting the performance from an unseen place. The melody was flawless, the phrasing exact, and the emotional depth was unmistakably hers. For those present, it was more than music, it was a message, a reminder, and a riddle all at once. Closer examination of the sheet music revealed something extraordinary. A pattern appeared within the notation that no one had noticed before, subtle markings and alterations that corresponded with details only Emily could have known. Small annotations, slight differences in rhythm, and a sequence of pauses seemed to map a path, almost like breadcrumbs left intentionally. Choir members realized that the piece itself might contain hidden clues, clues Emily had embedded for someone to find, for reasons that remained a mystery. Anxiety mingled with fascination as the students and director considered the possibility that Emily had somehow left a final communication through her music, a private language encoded in melody. Intrigued and unsettled, Margaret sought assistance from the local investigators who had maintained a connection with the family. Police technicians retrieved recordings from the church's surveillance cameras, hoping that some explanation might lie within the audio tracks. As they reviewed the footage, a faint, distorted voice was detected, barely audible behind the harmonies. It did not resemble any of the choir members' voices. It was fragmented, whispering instructions, guiding the timing and expression of the solo. Audio specialists enhanced the recording, confirming the anomaly. The voice was subtle, elusive, almost like a breath threading through the music, leading the choir through the unpracticed piece with uncanny precision. The investigators debated whether the recording might be evidence of a hoax or a technological manipulation, but there were no devices present, no signs of tampering, and no prior rehearsal of the solo in that formation. Psychologists consulted with the choir to address the emotional toll of the experience. Some students reported feeling Emily's presence physically, a sense of being watched and guided, while others described chills, goosebumps, or the sensation of the room subtly shifting as the music unfolded. These psychological responses, though explainable as grief-induced phenomena, did not diminish the profound effect on the rehearsal. The melody seemed to evoke both comfort and fear, a reminder of Emily's absence intertwined with an undeniable sense of connection. Within the community, word of the unexplainable solo spread quickly. Parents, church members, and local journalists were drawn to the story, framing it in the context of Emily's enduring influence and the mysterious forces surrounding her disappearance. Choir members became hesitant to discuss the event in detail, wary of speculation and sensationalism, yet they could not escape the emotional imprint it had left. Every rehearsal thereafter carried the echo of that solo, a reminder that Emily's music had transcended absence, communicating something beyond words. Margaret Hall documented each rehearsal meticulously, noting every instance where the solo seemed to emerge, every pattern within the sheet music, and every emotional response from her students. Experts in music theory and forensic audio were consulted to analyze the recordings and notation. While they could not offer a conclusive explanation, they agreed on one point. The emergence of Emily's solo and the accompanying patterns were not coincidental. The precision and subtle complexity indicated intention, as though the music itself had become a vessel for hidden information or a message awaiting discovery. As the night's rehearsal concluded, the choir sat in stunned silence. The final note of the solo lingered in the air, unresolved and haunting, leaving a room full of teenagers and adults alike grappling with a mixture of grief, fear, and awe. The phenomenon challenged their understanding of reality, blurring the line between memory and presence, music and communication, and absence and contact. Margaret reminded them that the memorial recital was approaching and that they would honor Emily through their performance, but the solo's appearance had changed their perception forever. The rehearsal ended with a shared, unspoken understanding. Emily's presence had not vanished. It had transformed, reaching them through the language she knew best, and in that transformation, a subtle promise lingered. The notion that the music held more secrets yet to be uncovered, mysteries encoded in melody that might one day illuminate the truth of her disappearance, offering guidance in a case that had confounded investigators and tormented the hearts of those left behind. For over 2 years, the haunting echoes of Emily Harper's disappearance lingered over St. Mark's Church and the surrounding town. Each rehearsal, each memorial, every whispered speculation carried the weight of unanswered questions. But in the months following the unexplainable solo performance, police and investigators had returned repeatedly to the recordings, dissecting every note, every subtle inflection, and every anomaly in the choir's harmonies. It was during a late-night analysis session in the sterile glow of a lab stacked with monitors and audio equipment that a detail previously overlooked finally surfaced, a pattern hidden in plain sight within Emily's sheet music. The notation, meticulously transcribed by the choir for rehearsals, had always seemed conventional. Yet forensic musicologists, reviewing the sequence in slow motion and digital magnification, noticed anomalies that were subtle enough to be missed by the untrained eye. Tiny, deliberate annotations, markings between measures, and slight deviations in the rhythm and spacing that appeared almost like a code. With the help of the police's technical team, these markings were analyzed against cartographic data and online mapping tools. What emerged was shocking: a series of coordinates, precise and deliberate, embedded within the music. Alongside the coordinates were cryptic references, shorthand notations, and fragments of words that hinted at secrecy, confinement, and contact. The revelation sent a ripple of disbelief through the investigative team. Coordinates in sheet music were unprecedented in the department's experience, yet the patterns were unmistakable once identified. Detectives cross-referenced the locations, and one point stood out: a small, secluded storage facility on the edge of town, overlooked and minimally monitored. The facility, known mostly to locals, housed a series of rented units, some abandoned for months. Investigators debated the plausibility, double-checking the information to avoid a futile confrontation, yet all signs suggested this was the first concrete lead in Emily's long and frustratingly opaque disappearance. A tactical team was assembled, careful and deliberate, cognizant of the potential dangers. The unit in question was accessed quietly, with officers prepared for any scenario. As the metal door was unlocked and the air inside stirred with dust and stagnation, they found the interior dimly lit but otherwise ordinary at first glance. Then, in the back corner, they discovered Emily Harper, alive, weak but coherent, sitting amidst a few personal items. Her eyes widened briefly at the intrusion, a mixture of relief and lingering fear crossing her face. Medical personnel quickly assessed her condition, confirming she was physically unharmed, though emotionally exhausted. It was the first tangible encounter in over 2 years, a confrontation that erased the lingering dread with the sudden, almost surreal relief of presence. Investigators also found notebooks, sheet music, and fragments of communication linked to the music tutor previously identified in connection to Emily's deleted messages. The evidence indicated that she had been in contact with him, communicating under a veil of secrecy and fear. The tutor, whose obsession with her talent had grown dangerously, had issued threats, prompting Emily to vanish voluntarily, hiding to protect herself while awaiting an opportunity to safely escape. Authorities later confirmed through digital forensics and recovered messages that the tutor's fixation had intensified in the months leading to her disappearance, providing a clear motive for Emily's self-imposed confinement. Interviews with Emily, conducted in a secure and quiet location, revealed the careful calculations she had undertaken to remain safe. She explained that she had embedded clues in her music deliberately, aware that her disappearance might trigger an investigation, but counting on her meticulous documentation to guide anyone who might discover the pattern. Each note, each subtle variation in the sheet music, had been intentional, a coded lifeline to the outside world. The realization that her skill as a musician had become both a shield and a tool for survival left the investigators both awed and relieved. The music that had once seemed to haunt the choir now stood as a testament to Emily's ingenuity, resilience, and quiet courage. The storage unit yielded further insights into her isolation. Notes indicated routines, methods for avoiding detection, and ways she had maintained her physical and mental well-being. The evidence painted a picture of careful preparation rather than random confinement, demonstrating that Emily had remained hidden by choice under extreme duress rather than as a passive victim. Each recovered item, from notebooks filled with notation to detailed plans for her safety, contributed to a narrative of survival amid threat and manipulation. As Emily was reunited with her family, the emotional impact was immediate and profound. Tears flowed freely, hands trembled, and the years of uncertainty and grief that had haunted the Harper household began to dissipate. replaced by relief and cautious hope. Psychologists accompanying the family emphasized the importance of gradual reintegration, acknowledging the trauma of isolation and the psychological consequences of prolonged fear. Even amidst joy, there was an awareness of the delicate path ahead, a need for careful emotional reconstruction after the ordeal. The case, once dominated by ambiguity, rumor, and supernatural speculation, had finally shifted into the realm of understanding and resolution. Investigators emphasized that the missing years, while painful, had ended without physical harm to Emily, and that the music, the very thing she loved and had mastered, had been her conduit to safety. Her coded sheet music, the subtle manipulations of melody and notation, became the definitive link in unraveling the mystery, validating the meticulous work of forensic analysts, musicians, and law enforcement officers. Even as the community breathed a collective sigh of relief, the story retained its haunting resonance. The idea that Emily had lived in secrecy for years, guided only by her intelligence, her caution, and the coded language of music, left a lingering sense of awe. What had begun as a disappearance steeped in fear and speculation now concluded with discovery and vindication, proving that sometimes the most profound mysteries can be solved not through force, but through subtle, patient observation and the quiet courage of one determined individual. The discovery at the storage unit closed one chapter, while underscoring the power of attention to detail, the persistence of hope, and the enduring connection between Emily's talent and her survival. For the Harper family, the community, and the choir that had felt her absence so deeply, it was the first moment in years that the word "found" carried its full, unambiguous weight, signaling not just the end of a disappearance, but the return of a life nearly lost to fear and obsession. The investigation that had haunted St. Mark's Church for more than 2 years finally took a decisive turn when authorities traced the last threads of Emily Harper's secret communications back to the local music tutor. Police surveillance and digital forensics revealed patterns of contact that were impossible to ignore. Emails, messages, and timestamps that aligned with Emily's disappearances from public view. The tutor, once considered a benign figure in the choir's extended community, was now at the center of a chilling revelation. His arrest, executed quietly to prevent public alarm, marked the beginning of the unraveling of a carefully orchestrated deception, one that had held Emily in isolation under a cloak of fear and manipulation. In the sterile interrogation room, the tutor sat with a composure that initially suggested denial, but as evidence mounted, his facade cracked. Investigators presented the timeline of Emily's disappearance, the coordinates hidden in her sheet music, and the recovered messages she had left behind. Faced with the inescapable logic of his actions, he confessed. He admitted to monitoring Emily's every movement, controlling her schedule, and orchestrating her disappearance to mold her music career according to his own obsessive vision. He had convinced her that leaving or contacting anyone outside their circle would result in consequences too severe to risk, turning her natural caution into a mechanism for control. Emily's diary entries, recovered during the search of the storage unit and carefully preserved by authorities, illuminated the psychological reality of her ordeal. Pages filled with precise handwriting, sometimes shaky and sometimes hurried, chronicled the progression of the tutor's obsession. Early entries described admiration that quickly transformed into pressure and coercion. Later passages revealed her growing fear and meticulous attempts to leave breadcrumbs for anyone who might look for her, including subtle manipulations in her sheet music and coded notes designed to draw attention without exposing her directly. The diaries were both a testament to her resilience and a roadmap of the torment she had endured, silently conveying her struggle to be understood and rescued. The community, initially stunned by Emily's return, now confronted the depths of manipulation that had occurred in their midst. Parents, choir members, and fellow congregants struggled to reconcile the image of a gentle, encouraging tutor with the reality of calculated psychological control and orchestrated isolation. The choir, still reeling from the extraordinary events surrounding their rehearsals and memorials, began to piece together the true significance of the unprompted solo performances that had startled and mystified them. What had once seemed inexplicable, eerie, or even supernatural was now understood as Emily's subtle method of signaling distress and asserting agency despite her constrained circumstances. Therapists working with the Harper family emphasized the profound emotional complexity of the case. For Emily, the trauma of isolation, manipulation, and coerced compliance left lingering scars, and reintegration required not only medical oversight, but also consistent psychological support. For the choir, processing the knowledge that they had unknowingly participated in sessions where Emily was signaling for help required a delicate balance of empathy and reflection. Members described a mixture of guilt, sorrow, and admiration, recognizing both their inability to intervene earlier and the ingenuity Emily demonstrated in using her musical talent to communicate under duress. Authorities pursued further charges against the tutor, documenting the manipulation, threats, and psychological coercion he had employed. The case became a touchstone for discussions of control and abuse in artistic mentorship, highlighting the dangers of unchecked authority and the subtle ways that obsession can escalate into confinement and isolation. Law enforcement underscored that Emily's recovery was exceptional, a combination of her intelligence, foresight, and courage, and that her experience served as both a cautionary tale and a narrative of hope. The resolution of the case also allowed the broader community to acknowledge the emotional resonance of the choir's experiences. Rehearsals that had been haunted by the mysterious emergence of Emily's solo now took on a reflective quality, a recognition that every note, every hesitation, and every subtle musical inflection had carried meaning beyond the technical performance. Choir members revisited their recordings, listening intently to each session, and slowly identified the cues Emily had embedded to signal distress. The realization deepened the sense of connection to her experience, fostering an atmosphere of empathy, remembrance, and communal healing. For Emily, the confrontation with the tutor and the acknowledgement of his manipulation provided a mixture of relief, validation, and sorrow. She expressed in interviews her gratitude for the investigators, her family, and the choir for supporting her indirectly while she remained in hiding. At the same time, she grappled with the psychological burden of betrayal, the weight of isolation, and the trauma of having her autonomy compromised. Counselors emphasized that recovery would be ongoing, but that the closure of the case offered an essential foundation for rebuilding trust, reclaiming her life, and re-engaging with her passion for music on her own terms. As the community absorbed the revelations, media coverage shifted from speculation about mysterious disappearances and supernatural interpretations to the concrete, harrowing reality of psychological manipulation and obsessive control. Documentaries, news articles, and social commentary framed the story as a multifaceted lesson in resilience, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring power of intelligence and ingenuity under extreme duress. Emily's coded messages, once obscure and enigmatic, became emblematic of her courage and foresight, demonstrating the extraordinary lengths she had gone to ensure she would eventually be found. The resolution of the tutor's arrest and confession closed the chapter on one of the most perplexing and emotionally charged cases in the town's recent history. The choir, the Harper family, and the community at large began the process of collective healing, understanding that the events which had seemed incomprehensible were, in fact, the product of human obsession and fear, navigated by Emily with remarkable subtlety and resilience. Her story, from disappearance to discovery, from subtle musical clues to confrontation with the perpetrator, underscored the intersection of courage, creativity, and the human will to survive, leaving a lasting imprint on all who had followed her journey, both intimately and from afar. After months of fear, uncertainty, and painstaking investigation, Emily Harper returned to the embrace of her family and the St. Mark's Choir. The long-awaited concert was set not merely as a performance, but as a symbolic reclaiming of her voice, her agency, and her life. The auditorium hummed with anticipation. The community, once anxious and fractured, now gathered to witness the culmination of a story that had gripped them for years. Every seat was filled with those who had followed her disappearance, supported the search, or been touched by the eerie mystery that had left the choir in a state of haunted confusion. When Emily stepped onto the stage, the quiet was absolute. She positioned herself before the microphone, shoulders squared, a mixture of apprehension and determination in her posture. The orchestra began, and as the first notes of her solo filled the space, there was a profound sense of gravity. Her voice, clear, flawless, and charged with emotion, carried a depth born not only of musical skill but of lived experience. Each phrase resonated as both art and testimony, a subtle declaration that the control, fear, and isolation she had endured would not define her. The audience, hushed and attentive, felt the narrative embedded in her performance, the struggle, the subtle pleas for help, and ultimately, the triumph of survival. Behind the scenes, police finalized the case. The tutor, whose obsession had driven Emily's concealment, faced formal charges for coercion, psychological manipulation, and the orchestration of her disappearance. Investigators emphasized the calculated nature of his actions and the extraordinary resilience Emily demonstrated in leaving clues for those searching. Her coded sheet music, her hidden diary entries, and the unprompted solos that had puzzled the choir now served as evidence of her ingenuity and courage under duress. Authorities noted that while Emily's ordeal was horrifying, it highlighted the potential for subtle, intelligent signals from victims that could guide intervention when properly interpreted. In interviews conducted after the concert, Emily spoke candidly about her experience. She reflected on the fear, isolation, and manipulation she had faced, but also on the strategies she had developed to maintain agency, protect herself, and communicate without exposing herself to greater danger. Choir members described their renewed appreciation for her resilience, acknowledging the subtle signs they had missed in the ways in which music had served as her lifeline. The community collectively absorbed these reflections, understanding that talent can attract admiration, but also dangerous obsession, and that awareness, vigilance, and support structures are essential for protecting young people. The concert ended with prolonged applause, a standing ovation that expressed relief, admiration, and shared emotional release. The choir, once fractured by confusion and fear, now stood united, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. Emily's solo was more than a performance. It was a reclamation of autonomy, a statement of survival, and a reminder that even under extraordinary duress, resilience and courage can create a path to freedom. As the last note faded, the story of Emily Harper transformed from a haunting mystery to a testament of hope, careful vigilance, and the power of human determination in the face of obsession and control.